Hey everyone, I'm up and down here today because I've got a double stream going. Now it's very possible that the one down here is Circle, so which would be, it's part of the Knit Hub community, and on Knit Hub we've got the ability to do live streaming, and I very rarely take advantage of it. But the Knitalong seemed perfect because I'm able to set the whole thing up whereby I can record it and then post it up for later. So having one kind of tied in with each of the clue launches and things would make sense, so that if people come back later, it's all there. And of course, if you're watching it on Instagram, it's the same thing because I'm able to record it and post it back up there. Hello from New York, nice to see you. As always, I love seeing people jump in, so just pop yourself up, say hello, and it would be lovely to see anyone who's up there. If you are on Circle and you've got a particular question, you've got a little chat section there that I've got going down here. So you can pop questions up in there if there's a question that you want answered. And it is very exciting to be here because this has been a much anticipated Knitalong launch. You may have kind of heard me talking a little bit about the Knitalong to a certain extent for the last few months, because of the fact that it's a sweater that is quite close to my heart, because I've been thinking about knitting it for several years. Elsa Louise, you couldn't figure out the sign in for Circle, so you came to Instagram. Fantastic, and which is why I ended up doing both, because that way people can find me in all different places. Seeing Travis Tweed from Colorado, hey, nice to see you. But yes, so it was something that I had been thinking about, and I loved the shoulder construction, couldn't figure out how to do it with a sweater. And I think the reason I was having so much difficulty is because I was trying to do it all completely seamlessly, because I usually like to do things seamlessly. And so I'll tend to keep pushing through to see if I can find a seamless solution. And the solution came, but it was a nearly rather than completely seamless, because what ends up happening is if you push into a way of doing things just for the sake of it, you're actually not doing yourself any favors, because of the fact that it means that, because basically all you're doing is you're trying to make the answer fit the question you've got to a certain extent. Elsa Louise, what type of needles did I use for the Hathorne? I used my Haya needles. I kind of alternated between the bamboo tips and the metal tips. You probably, like if you're actually going through the videos, you'll probably be able to see which ones I used most. If I remember correctly, it was probably bamboo, because of the yak in Nua, I tend to find it quite slippy. So that I kind of, bamboo tends to give me a slightly better gauge because it just sticks a little bit more. But that also depends on the stitch patterns. Because it's a textured stitch pattern, you're fairly flexible in terms of what kind of needles you use, because it's really going to work for both. So I've got Edwina, glad you're able to join, and Linda, lovely to see you there. I've got my little double thing going here. It's fantastic. And do with both places again. If there's other questions pop up, just shoot them up. If you are in the Knitalong, you should at this point have gotten an email download either from Ravelry or from Stolen Stitches, or maybe from both, depending on where you got it. And so you'll have the new download. So the way I do the Knitalongs is I keep one PDF so that it's always obvious which one you're meant to download. But I put the new pages at the end, so it will kind of keep building out, and it keeps getting longer, but you don't need to keep putting each one in as you go. You can just, you just need to print out the last couple of pages if you print them out. So in this case, it's just page 7. The rest of it is the information. Lady Doc, Elsa Louise, do you like my cardigan? Thank you very much. Yes, Elsa, it is actually, it's the Donegal. It's Donegal Chunky. This is next week, and it's actually a reknit of an older cardigan, but in a different gauge. But there will be some new stuff next week. But I'll tell you all about that next week. I will be traveling, but there'll be a newsletter that'll come out talking a little bit about that next one. But I'll try not to get too distracted today from my launch and talking through the Knitalong. The kind of things that have been coming up in terms of questions so far with the swatching is for people trying to keep track of the stitch patterns. And I will tell you the same thing, that I actually had to come up with a few different ways of trying to track stitch patterns, because it is a challenge when you've got combinations of knit and purl and there's very little variation between the right and the wrong side. You kind of need to pay close attention, because you can spend more time undoing rows than you do knitting the rows. So the first thing I did was when I was working both back and forth, I made sure I put a marker on my right side row. Then for these ones, what you've got, first of all, for the mistake rib is pretty straightforward, because you've got knit round and then alternating knit purl round. So that one is okay. It's really when you move on to the sand stitch that you can kind of run into problems, because you've got 4 different rows, but the ones in between are all knit and then the other ones are alternating. So what I did is I just ended up drawing up a grid and marking as I went through with each one. When I traveled, I didn't really go too far in this direction, but I think it would also be a very good solution is if you have a marker or 2 different color markers and you just color code them, or just put a string on one indicating that when I'm doing a knit row, I'm going to put this marker on the front of it and know I start with the knit stitch. So then when you come along to the next one, take that off and you know it's purl next. So just something kind of as a little visual reminder, so that you know which one you did last. Now, in an ideal world, obviously we're going to run back down and you're able to read off your knitting. But the ones that I ran into problems with, and you probably will as well, is the knit purl rows are on the wrong side. And because it's not as obvious as to what's happening, you have to look from the right side of the work and then reverse it back. So it is a little tricky, and it's a hard one when you're doing it in rows. Not in rounds is fine, but in rows, it is a little harder to keep track of the sand stitch. So either doing a grid up, or alternatively using a specific marker for, starting with the knit stitch, I'll put that marker in. Maybe a different one when I'm starting with the purl stitch, or maybe none. But those are the best ways I came across of kind of tracking it. And there's a couple of questions there I missed. Let me just pull this down. Where is it? Oh, I know I did miss here. It was, oh yes, Elsa Louise, you were asking, did I do a flat or in the round swatch? Under normal circumstances, I would always say if you're going to do it in the round, make sure you do an in the round swatch, particularly if you have big variations between your knit and your purl gauge. Sometimes people don't have that issue, in which case it makes no difference. And for this particular stitch pattern, because you're continually alternating between knit and purl, both in the flat and in the round, I found that I was getting a very, very consistent gauge between both, and so it was much less critical that I swatched in the round with this. If you're concerned that it's going to be a problem, then by all means, go ahead and swatch in the round. But I do find that this is one of those ones where I think you can get away with it flat because of all those alternating knits and purls. Because it's the difference in purl stitch is what usually makes such a big difference to in the round swatches. Because when you've got purl stitches, a standard purl stitch takes up extra yarn, which means that it's generally going to be a little looser. Some knitting styles are going to be a lot looser. In those cases, they're the ones where you may find that perhaps you find a different technique for purling the stitches, or you change needle size when you purl, or you change needle size when you move from flat to in the round. So they're kind of the situations where it can make a big difference, but it's really all down to those purl stitches, which want to be looser, and so they take up more space basically. So that's why you would sometimes work in the round. When it comes to different needle types, I would suggest trying a couple out, because I do usually find that I'll keep both needle tips with me when I'm swatching, and I'll swatch a little bit with each, and I'll see which one gives me the nicer gauge, and more importantly, which feels more comfortable to knit with. Does it flow more smoothly? Does it have a nice flow to it? Really is the best way of putting it, because if you've got a good flow on your needles, it's just much more comfortable to knit with. And these ones here, these were the new worsted. Dare You is the colour from the sample. It's a very hard one to photograph because it is a red, but it's a very deep, deep red. So in some photographs, it veers a little more to the purpley, kind of purpley browny colors, but it really is a deep red. But the yak in Nua, it's fascinating. It's just like cashmere, it's just a little bit slippier. And so as you're knitting with it, I just find it tends to slick on the needles, and sticky needles help for me hold it in place. If you would want to get a kit in Dare You, we ran out of the color, and then when we were pulling some of it together for our seasons, we've got a small bit left of it. The supplier is now out of Dare You, so we've got the last couple of packs left of this color. So there's 1 or 2 kits left in this color if you want to go grab some. There's 2 other colors that are quite different, but I think look really lovely as well. This one is Cerebellum, another really hard one to photograph because this one is dusty pink, best way of putting it, like this really deep, dusty pink is what this looks like when you're working with it. And a good autumn favorite, this is Rolling Bales, so a lovely kind of rich, yellowy, rusty hay colors. This is to me like really, really deep, beautiful hay colors. This time of year, they're just finishing up the bales. And I was going to say this time of year they got the bales out. It was really a few weeks ago, but this is what we saw everywhere. So now for the construction of it, kind of talked about the yarns, needles, swatching, and in terms of picking sizes, I would suggest a few inches of positive ease, because you don't want this too tight fitting. You can see there's kind of a really nice drape to it, and so you don't want super tight fitting because you're going to lose that to a certain extent. So give yourself a little bit of positive ease. If you don't like a huge amount of positive ease, then size it down a little bit, and you will be able to get away with it because there's 2 things going on that work in your favor. First one is there's a split hem here. So it means that if your hips are a little wider, but you want to kind of snug it down a bit for the bust, the split hem is going to give you a whole lot of extra room down there. So without doing any shaping, you're actually still going to get a little bit of extra room down at the bottom. And then the other thing is it's designed with kind of very generously sized armholes and sleeve shaping at the top. So if you've sized it down, the sleeves obviously are going to be smaller as well, but it should still work for your size. Just check that you've got enough ease for the upper arm, because you don't want the upper arm in this tight. It's going to be a little bit looser, not terribly snug fitting, because it just works. If you're going to go for ease in one place, you kind of want it in the sleeve, you kind of want it just a little slouchier, a different type of style, basically. In terms of knitting through it, you're going to start with your front hem and your back hem. They're both identical, and you can see there's quite a big stretch here where they're separate. I haven't done one with such a large separation, but it worked quite well for this, because I've done before where I've done little ones and it's got a really different effect. Whereas I do find that when you've got a nice big deep section down there, it is just much more generous. It means that when you put your pockets in your pockets in your hands in your pockets, it's got a split where it opens up and it's not going to slouch up on you. So it's actually more useful to have a little bit deeper. If you would rather have a short one, then you literally will just work a little bit shorter, join it in the round a bit sooner, and then you're working the rest of it in the round up there. So it's going to work pretty much the same. The only difference you might have is it's possible that perhaps you'll just work the mistake rib, and when you join in the round, you go on to the sand stitch or something like that, because you probably won't have enough room to also do a section of flat stand stitch if you're going to make it shallower. And you could actually, even if you wanted to go one step further and you're like, I really hate split hems, then you just start the body at the point where it's in the round, because it's a couple of stitches less. But what you're going to want to do is you will still want to start with mistake rib, so that you've got ribbing across the bottom, and then you move on to your sand stitch and your mistake rib. So there are a few different options for kind of starting at the bottom like that. In terms of body shape, it's straight down, again, goes with the whole slouchy, easy wearing fit and things like that. But if you want to have a little bit more shaping, I wouldn't go for something that was kind of in and out. You could possibly try some A-line shaping, where You started with a wider size in the bottom and then decreased it up to the upper arms here to a smaller size. So do try and aim to finish up here with one of the sizes in the patterns, because otherwise you're going to have to do a lot of recalculation. But if you actually finish up with the stitches that fit a particular size, it means that there's much less modification needs to be done at that point, because you've got all of the stitches are going to be where they're supposed to be. So I think that's probably the easiest way to make those kind of modifications, is to just make sure you finish with the stitches. And the other thing I would also suggest is do your decreases in doubles, because this is a 2-stitch pattern repeat. So you've got like knit, purl, or purl, knit, repeating over. If you take 2 stitches out each side at a time, it means you're never going to go out of pattern, and you don't have to worry about which stitch do I start now, is a knit or is it a purl, because you've pulled the whole thing out, and so you'll be exactly where you need to be. So that, I think, makes it a lot easier, because that's eventually what I do with the sleeves and things like that. And when I'm doing other decreases, I'm doing it as double. So if you take a look on the side here, you've got this central mistake rib panel running down the side. So when you're doing your decreases, if you added in an A-line shaping, if you put decreases, a double decrease there and a double decrease there, it's going to create quite a nice little seam line running up to each side of your mistake rib. So I think it's probably going to be the best way to put it. And I'm not saying you should put A-line shaping in. I love it with the square shaping of this, because I kind of feel that the split hem gives it a little bit of shape to a certain extent as well. But everybody's different, and if your body suits A-line shaping better, then go right ahead, and please go ahead and add it in. I mean, pop into Knit Hub as well so that we can chat through. I've just put up a knittle thread there where if you want some help or you want to chat through things, you can jump in there. Same on the workshop. If you go into the Teachable workshop, there's the option of putting in comments along there where I'll kind of be able to see them. Knit Hub is probably easier because other people can see them more quickly and I get a notification. Whereas Teachable, I have to remember to log in and check on the back end. So sometimes it might be every couple of days because I literally just forget. So unfortunately, there's too many things going on. Well, we're back now to the start of this. So we had started here. We had done the cast on first of all, and I don't know if you can see this here. This is one of my favorite cast ons. If I'm going to do something that alternates between knit and purl, I love the alternating cable cast on. It's just magic. It basically creates a cast on that looks like a tubular cast on where your knit stitches flow into the knit stitches, purl stitches flow into the purl stitches. It is way easier to do than any kind of a tubular cast on, but it's got a bit of stretch, it rolls right up, and it's just, there's no disjointed effect of here's my cast on, oh, and we're going straight into the knit stitches. So the alternating cable cast on is just fantastic for anything that's knit and purl. There's a variant where you can do knit 2, purl 2, but it's much trickier and quite messy to work, so I tend to avoid it for that. But for 1 by 1, it's straight out of the box, easy to do. So it's a good option for that. Mistake rib, I had somebody kind of was popping on saying that they really loved the way the mistake ribbed, is that it's actually way more interesting than your normal rib. And it looks totally different because this is on the front here. It looks fairly like a rib. It's like garter with the rib in between. But on the other side, it's totally different. It's a little bit closer to kind of a peculiar looking moss stitch is the best way of putting it. So totally different on both sides. So that makes it actually quite easy when you're doing mistake rib flat and or even in other spots where you've got mistake rib set up. Because it looks so different on the right and the wrong side, you're not going to make a mistake or mess it up. That part is very easy. We also, when you're doing this, I've got an odd number of stitches. So that way it means that it's even or it's balanced. So you start with the knit stitch and you end with the knit stitch. But to do that, you need to have an odd number of stitches. So odd number of stitches all the way across here so that you can have it nice and symmetrical all the way across. Once you've done several inches of your mistake ribbing, at that point, the middle section is going to move into the sand stitch. And then the 2 outer sections, we're going to keep just a little bit of mistake rib here and a little bit of mistake rib over there. So that part is pretty straightforward. You continue the 2 up. Where you need to keep an eye out is when you join the two together. Remember I was telling you that it's symmetrical, so you want to start and end on the same. That causes a problem when you join them up together here, because you get two of the same stitches together and your stitch pattern is not going to flow. So you end up using a decrease, where two benefits. One, it gives you a really tidy join between the two. And secondly, it means that your stitch pattern is then continuous. So often when you're coming up like this, you can end up with kind of a loose section down the side. But by adding in a decrease, it means that you're getting rid of that problem and it's tidying it up really nicely along both sides. So two birds with one stone, so to speak. You get to do two things that are advantageous to you. And you can see here that mistake rib goes all the way up along the side here. And we will, in further clues, it'll be separated. For now, there's no separation. And your sand stitch is worked up along here. You will probably find for this section, when it's worked flat, that it is hard to keep track of. So kind of come back to the things that I was suggesting, and you know, you never know, you may come up with a really, really good way of keeping track of it. So if you could share it with the other knitters, that would be great, because I think that that way we'll all learn from each other. And it just never ceases to amaze me how different people see things differently, or have different ideas or different ways of doing it. And it's a huge help to everyone who's knitting through. But I didn't really get into it, but I do think that the idea of different color markers when you're starting knits versus purls, particularly if you write it down and take note of it, is potentially really useful, because that way you're not going to forget. And you'll see very quickly when it needs to be a knit row, you'll very quickly be able to see that, because it's going to be quite obvious which side you're on. But the knit purl ones, those ones will catch you out, because they do. Because they tend to, it's not immediately obvious because you're working them on the wrong side row, but you see them most clearly on the right side row. So keep an eye on that. And also, I used to find that if I made a mistake, I wouldn't immediately see it. So when you're finished working it, or if you've every few rows, put it down and just move back and take a look to see if it looks like it's a little out. Because sometimes you can get a little out of pattern and not actually realize you have until you've gone much further down. Whereas if you've just got one or two rows and you'll spot it, you can undo it very quickly at that point. I used to often find that it was when I was tired, or if I was talking with people, I was running into problems, and then I ended up doing more unknitting than I did knitting. And that's the point where I'm like, I'm just going to put it down until I can refocus on it and make it work properly when I'm awake and set myself up properly. Linda, you were saying you're going to try your knit companion to keep track of the sand stitch. Yeah, that's a really good idea. And it's the same way as I was kind of talking about as you're working through. The only time I ever ran into problems really is if I was talking to people or tired or distracted, I'd forget to kind of move myself up along, and then I'd discover after the fact that I had fallen out of step. But the big thing is to regularly just look at your knitting and see if it looks wrong. Because what will happen is, if you put two of the same one, it'll start moving from sand stitch into something that's starting to look closer to your mistake rib. So if you start seeing a mistake rib appearing, what that means is you've done a row that's wrong, and so you can just undo it and come back. Spotting it quickly means that it's one row to undo as opposed to, you know, several inches of work. So keep looking at it, keeping track of it, and just knitting with awareness is probably the best way of putting it. So Edwina, on your swatch you found using a stitch marker at the beginning of the second row of the pattern each time worked. Oh, fantastic. Yeah, so like a variation of what I was saying was, if just something that is a trigger saying, when I come back I remember what I'm doing. Probably depends on how distractible you are. I think that my knitting time is often when I'm tired or when I'm talking with people. So I do run into problems with these kind of patterns because I'm knitting by rote and I'm not always being conscientious enough of it. So I have to be very careful at stopping and stepping back and checking it. Is there any other questions before we finish up there that you've kind of encountered, or something you're worried about that you think will cause you a problem? I mean, if you do and we don't have time to answer it here today, or you get it while you're watching it in replay and you're realizing, oh, I really wish I could ask that, just pop up the questions. We're always here to answer them at any point. Because this was a longer clue, we've given a couple of weeks for this, but it will be quite a long clue because this is the bulk of it. Each other one is going to be a little bit shorter, so that because there's smaller sections that we're working on, but this one there is quite a bulk of knitting. If you don't get to the end of clue 1 when clue 2 comes out, don't worry, it's definitely not a race. We want you to enjoy the process and most importantly, really, really be happy with the sweater that you've got when you come out of it. So that is more important than anything else. It's just enjoy the process, and the deadlines are just there to kind of give you a little bit of impetus to kind of help you move along, to hopefully help you prevent getting stalled. But if it doesn't fit in with your life, all of the videos will be there as long as you need them. We'll be here to help you along. So just work away at your own pace, and hopefully you'll enjoy the process. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you again when the next clue comes out, and I'll talk a little bit through it with you as well. Bye.